In Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, just 25 minutes from the heart of Philadelphia, there stands a palace that time forgot. Behind rusted gates and overgrown hedges, 110 rooms sit in darkness. Plywood boards cover windows that once framed priceless Rembrandts and Raphaels. Rain seeps through holes in a roof that once sheltered America's wealthiest family. This is Lynnewood Hall, and it wasn't supposed to end like this. Stretching 325 feet across, longer than a football field, the mansion rises from a limestone foundation, like a monument to American ambition. Its classical columns still command respect, even as nature slowly reclaims the formal gardens. The iron gates, rusted but unbroken, bear witness to a time when this was called the last American Versailles, when it housed one of the world's greatest art collections, and when it stood as the crown jewel of the Gilded Age. But Lynnewood Hall tells a darker story than most grand estates. This is a house haunted by the Titanic disaster, abandoned by economic necessity, and forgotten by a world that had moved on from the age of private palaces. It survived the Great Depression when many similar mansions fell to the wrecking ball, only to face a slower, more heartbreaking decline. How did America's most magnificent private residence become one of its most tragic ruins? The answer lies not just in changing times, but in a family's extraordinary rise, devastating loss, and the ultimate realization that some dreams are too grand to survive. This is the story of Lynnewood Hall, from its glorious beginning as a streetcar tycoon's palace to its current fight for survival. It's a story that begins not with grandeur, but with a young German immigrant son who understood that in America, anything was possible. Chapter 1. A Butcher's Dream, November 13th, 1834. Philadelphia's Northern Liberties District buzzed with the energy of a rapidly growing American city. In a modest row house, Hannah and Joseph Widener welcomed their son Peter Errol Brown Widener into a world where German immigrants like themselves worked with their hands and hoped their children might do better. Joseph Widener was a bricklayer, skilled work, but hardly the path to fortune. The family moved frequently as Joseph chased construction projects around Philadelphia, and young Peter learned early that security came only through hard work and sharp thinking. At 14, he left school to apprentice with a local butcher, learning to cut meat with precision and, more importantly, to read people and their needs. By his mid-20s, Peter had saved enough to open his own butcher shop in a bustling Philadelphia market. But this wasn't just any butcher shop. Peter understood that meat was only part of what he was selling. He was selling trust, reliability, and quality. His shop became a gathering place where working-class Philadelphians could count on honest weights and fair prices. Word spread, and soon Peter was supplying multiple shops across the city. The Civil War changed everything. When the Union Army needed someone to supply fresh mutton to troops within 10 miles of Philadelphia, Peter Widener saw opportunity where others saw risk. He underbid his competitors and won the contract, earning $50,000, roughly $850,000 in today's money, in just a few years. While other young men marched off to war, Peter Widener fed the war machine and emerged wealthy enough to dream bigger dreams. But meat was just the beginning. Peter had been watching Philadelphia's rapid growth and noticed something that would define his fortune. People needed to move around the expanding city. Horse-drawn omnibuses were slow and expensive. The city's scattered streetcar lines were poorly managed and often broke down. Peter saw chaos, but he also saw potential. In 1873, Peter's political connections, built through years of knowing his customers and their families, paid off when he was appointed Philadelphia City Treasurer. It was the most lucrative political position in the city because the treasurer kept all interest earned on city deposits. But more than money, the position gave Peter something priceless: access to information, connections, and influence. This was where Peter met William Lukens Elkins, a grocer-turned-politician who shared Peter's vision of what Philadelphia could become. The two men recognized kindred spirits in each other, immigrant sons who understood that wealth in America went not to those born with it, but to those bold enough to seize it. Together, Peter and Elkins began buying shares in Philadelphia's scattered streetcar companies. They didn't just want to own streetcars, they wanted to revolutionize urban transportation. Their timing was perfect. Philadelphia was expanding rapidly, and workers needed affordable ways to commute from growing neighborhoods to job sites downtown. By 1883, Peter and Elkins had consolidated nearly every streetcar line in Philadelphia under their Philadelphia Traction Company. But their real genius lay in modernization. While competitors clung to horse-drawn cars, Peter and Elkins invested in electric power. They hired the best engineers, imported the latest technology, and by the 1890s had created the most efficient urban transportation network in America. The profits were staggering. By 1900, their streetcar empire extended to New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, controlling over 500 miles of track. Peter had transformed himself from a neighborhood butcher into one of America's wealthiest men with a fortune estimated at $35 million, making him the richest man in Philadelphia. But Peter Widener never forgot his humble origins. Even as his wealth grew, he remained personally unpretentious, preferring simple meals and modest clothing. What changed was his vision of what that wealth could accomplish. He began collecting art, not for show, but because he believed beautiful things should be preserved and shared. And he began dreaming of a home worthy of the greatest art collection in America. The man who started as a butcher's apprentice now stood ready to build a palace that would rival anything in Europe. All he needed was the right architect and the perfect location. In Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, surrounded by rolling countryside but close enough to Philadelphia for daily business, Peter Widener found his spot. And in a young architect named Horace Trumbauer, he found someone who shared his understanding that in America, dreams could become reality on a scale the old world had never imagined. Chapter 2. The Boy Who Saw Castles, December 28, 1868. In Philadelphia, another modest family welcomed a son who would reshape how America thought about grandeur. Horace Trumbauer entered the world as the son of a traveling salesman, hardly destined for greatness. His family moved to Jenkintown when Horace was 11, and by 14, the restless boy had left school to work as an office clerk for the Philadelphia architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt. Most 14-year-olds would have seen only drudgery in sweeping floors and filing blueprints, but Horace Trumbauer saw magic in those architectural drawings. He watched the Hewitt brothers transform ideas into structures, sketches into buildings that would outlive their creators. During his 6-year apprenticeship, Horace absorbed not just technical skills, but something deeper, an understanding that architecture could make statements about power, wealth, and aspiration. At 21, with remarkable confidence for someone so young, Horace opened his own architectural office in 1891. His first commissions were modest, middle-class houses for Philadelphia's growing suburbs. But Horace studied the great estates he read about in European architecture books, dreaming of the day he might design something truly magnificent. That day came sooner than expected. In 1893, sugar magnate William Welsh Harrison commissioned Horace to design Grey Towers Castle in nearby Glenside. Harrison wanted something that would announce his arrival among Philadelphia's elite, and Horace delivered brilliantly. The castle's exterior borrowed from Alnwick Castle in Northumberland, England, while its interiors showcased French Renaissance design. Rising 40 rooms across multiple floors, Grey Towers proved that a self-taught architect could create European grandeur on American soil. Harrison was delighted with Trumbauer's work, but more importantly for the young architect's future, Harrison had friends, wealthy friends who were always looking for ways to display their success. At a dinner party in 1896, Harrison mentioned his architect to Peter A.B. Widener, the streetcar tycoon who had recently outgrown his Philadelphia mansion and needed something grander for his expanding art collection. When Peter Widener visited Grey Towers and met the shy, soft-spoken architect who had created it, he recognized something special. Here was someone who understood that buildings could be more than shelters. They could be statements of achievement, museums for great art, and legacies for future generations. Trumbauer's youth, he was only 29, didn't concern Widener. In fact, it excited him. Here was an architect whose career would grow alongside Widener's own expanding vision. The commission Widener offered was unlike anything Trumbauer had tackled. The client wanted a country estate that would rival the greatest houses of Europe, but it had to be unmistakably American in its scale and ambition. It would house one of the world's great art collections, entertain international guests, and serve as the countryside retreat for one of America's wealthiest families. Cost was no object. The only requirements were excellence and permanence. Trumbauer spent months studying the great houses of Europe, particularly Prior Park, a Palladian palace in Bath, England, designed by John Wood the Elder in the mid-18th century. But he understood this couldn't be a mere copy. American wealth demanded American scale, and the latest technology should enhance, rather than hide, the building's classical beauty. Working from his small office, the young architect began sketching plans for a palace that would stretch 325 feet across and 215 feet deep, larger than most European royal residences. He envisioned 110 rooms arranged around a central hall that would showcase Widener's art collection. The building would be constructed from the finest materials: Indiana limestone over a steel frame, Florentine bronze doors, marble from multiple quarries, and innovative lighting designed specifically to display paintings and sculptures. But Trumbauer's genius lay not just in scale, but in details. He planned hidden safes for the most valuable art pieces, servant passages that would keep the household functioning invisibly, and climate control systems that would preserve priceless works for generations. Every room would have a purpose, every corridor would lead somewhere meaningful, and every window would frame a carefully planned view. The collaboration between Widener and Trumbauer represented something new in American architecture: the marriage of unlimited resources with unlimited ambition, guided by sophisticated taste and genuine appreciation for beauty. Widener brought the vision and the means. Trumbauer brought the skill to make dreams tangible. Ground was broken in the fall of 1897. As construction began, Trumbauer spent countless hours on site, ensuring that every detail met his exacting standards. He was creating more than a house. He was creating a testament to what American wealth and talent could achieve when given free rein. At 29, Horace Trumbauer was about to give America its greatest palace. Chapter 3. Building the American Versailles Fall. 1897. The rolling countryside of Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, erupted with activity as hundreds of workers began what would become one of the most ambitious construction projects in American history. Peter Widener had purchased 300 acres of prime land, and Horace Trumbauer was about to prove that American architects could create something to rival anything in Europe. The scale alone was breathtaking. The mansion would measure 325 feet in length and 215 feet in depth, a footprint large enough to hold 4 city blocks. But size was only the beginning. Trumbauer insisted on using the finest materials available anywhere in the world, regardless of cost. The foundation would be pure Indiana limestone laid over a revolutionary steel I-beam skeleton, ensuring the building could stand for centuries. Every morning, trains arrived from quarries across America carrying carved limestone blocks, each precisely cut to Trumbauer's specifications. Ships docked at Philadelphia bringing materials from Europe: Constone from French quarries for decorative details, multiple varieties of marble from Italian mountains, and bronze fixtures cast in Florence using techniques perfected during the Renaissance. The main entrance alone required months of work. Florentine artisans had cast massive bronze doors decorated with intricate relief work that would have impressed Medici princes. 6 towering Corinthian columns, each carved from single limestone blocks, supported a pediment adorned with classical figures. The central portico was accessed by a broad stone staircase designed to make visitors feel they were approaching something extraordinary. Inside, Trumbauer's vision became even more ambitious. The central hall stretched 50 feet high, with walls of multicolored marble carefully selected to enhance rather than compete with the art that would hang there. A coffered ceiling showcased intricate plasterwork that required European craftsmen to achieve the proper detail. Everything was designed around the revolutionary lighting system Trumbauer had planned specifically for displaying paintings. The art gallery represented Trumbauer's most innovative thinking. Understanding that natural light could damage priceless works, he created a system of adjustable skylights with diffusing screens that could direct perfect illumination onto any painting or sculpture. The gallery walls could be reconfigured as Widener's collection grew, and hidden climate control systems would maintain consistent temperature and humidity. Work continued through bitter Pennsylvania winters and sweltering summers. At the project's peak, over 600 workers labored on the estate. Italian stonemasons shaped limestone blocks by hand. German cabinet makers created custom millwork that would never need replacement. French decorative artists painted frescoes and installed gilded details that caught light from crystal chandeliers crafted by E.F. Caldwell, the premier lighting designer of the era. But Trumbauer wasn't building just a house. He was creating a complete estate. The grounds required their own army of workers led by head gardener William Kleinheinz. Teams of laborers sculpted the natural landscape into formal gardens, constructed outbuildings that would house the estate's operations, and laid out carriage paths that would allow guests to approach the mansion through carefully planned vistas. The mansion's technical systems represented the latest innovations available. An electrical power plant on the grounds provided consistent electricity for the revolutionary lighting systems. Advanced plumbing brought hot and running water to every floor. Steam heat warmed all 110 rooms through a distribution system hidden within the walls. Telephone lines connected the mansion to Philadelphia, allowing Widener to manage his business empire from his countryside retreat. By 1899, the mansion stood complete, its limestone facade gleaming against the Pennsylvania countryside. The final cost exceeded $8 million, equivalent to over $300 million today. But walking through the completed rooms, even the normally frugal Peter Widener recognized he had acquired something beyond price. This wasn't just the largest private residence in America. It was a work of art large enough to live in. Trumbauer had created something unprecedented, a house that was simultaneously intimate enough for family life and grand enough to showcase the greatest art collection in America. Every room had been designed with specific purposes in mind, yet the overall effect was one of effortless elegance rather than ostentatious display. The crowning achievement was the ballroom, large enough to accommodate 1,000 guests, with a vaulted ceiling that created perfect acoustics for chamber music or full orchestras. Walls of warm wood paneling could be adjusted to reveal hidden alcoves for displaying sculpture. Even at its grandest, Lynnewood Hall felt like a home rather than a museum. On December 19, 1899, Peter and Hannah Widener hosted the mansion's opening gala. As carriages rolled up the circular drive and guests ascended the limestone steps between those towering columns, they entered not just a new house, but a new era in American architecture. Horace Trumbauer, still only 31 years old, had given America its greatest palace. Lynnewood Hall was ready for its golden age. Chapter 4. The Collector's Palace Christmas. 1899. Lynnewood Hall blazed with light as Philadelphia's elite gathered to celebrate the opening of America's greatest private palace. Gas flames flickered in crystal chandeliers, casting warm light over walls lined with masterpieces by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Van Dyck. As guests wandered through corridors wide enough for carriages, they whispered that they had never seen anything like this in America, or anywhere else. Peter Widener had built more than a mansion. He had created a temple to beauty. The main art gallery stretched like a cathedral nave with paintings arranged not for storage, but for contemplation. Here hung Raphael's small Cowper Madonna, its delicate blues and golds, perfectly illuminated by Trumbauer's innovative lighting system. Nearby, 14 Rembrandts commanded entire walls, their rich browns and dramatic shadows drawing viewers into scenes of Dutch middle-class life 3 centuries earlier. But Widener's collection went beyond paintings. Display cases held Chinese porcelain collected over decades, their delicate glazes reflecting centuries of artistic tradition. European tapestries, some woven for medieval castles, covered walls in smaller rooms. Renaissance bronzes by masters like Donatello occupied specially designed niches where guests could study their craftsmanship from every angle. What made Lynnewood Hall extraordinary wasn't just the value of its contents, though the collection was worth over $50 million by the 1940s, but how those contents were displayed. Unlike many wealthy collectors who packed their acquisitions into crowded rooms, Widener and Trumbauer had designed each space to enhance the art it contained. The Van Dyck room featured wood paneling and furniture that complemented the portrait's rich colors. The sculpture hall provided perfect sight lines and lighting to appreciate three-dimensional works. The mansion's daily life matched its grandeur. Peter and Hannah Widener lived with the quiet dignity of people who understood their responsibility to preserve beauty for future generations. Breakfast was served in the morning room overlooking formal gardens. Business was conducted in Peter's office, where reports from streetcar operations across America arrived daily. Evenings were spent in the library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the gentle ticking of antique clocks. But Lynnewood Hall truly came alive when the Wideners entertained. The mansion's ballroom could accommodate 1,000 guests, its acoustics perfect for the chamber music ensembles or full orchestras that perform for gatherings of international scope. In 1931, the Italian foreign minister stopped for dinner before continuing to Washington. The Crown Prince of Sweden toured the art collection. Spanish royalty walked the same corridors where Philadelphia streetcar workers' children would later study the paintings during the collection's public viewing periods. Hannah Widener proved herself the perfect hostess for such occasions. She understood that great wealth carried the obligation to share beauty with others. Rather than keeping the collection private, she opened Lynnewood Hall to the public from June through October each year, by appointment. Ordinary citizens could walk the same galleries where European nobility had been entertained, studying masterpieces that most museums couldn't afford to acquire. The estate's grounds reflected the same attention to excellence as the mansion's interior. Head gardener William Kleinheinz had transformed 33 acres into formal gardens that rivaled those of European palaces. Carefully planned sightlines led visitors through landscapes that changed with the seasons. Hidden, conservatories allowed rare plants to flourish year-round, while extensive greenhouse operations supplied fresh flowers for the mansion's countless rooms. The Widener family's life at Lynnewood Hall established new standards for American entertaining. Their dinner parties became legendary for their sophisticated menus, international guest lists, and cultured conversation. Yet the family never lost touch with their Philadelphia roots. Peter continued to personally oversee his business operations, traveling regularly to inspect streetcar systems in other cities and maintaining relationships with workers who had helped build his empire. The mansion's 110 rooms allowed for extraordinary hospitality. Guest suites could accommodate visiting dignitaries for extended stays. The library served as an informal meeting place where business deals were discussed among leather-bound first editions. The conservatory provided a retreat where Hannah could pursue her interest in botany while overseeing the mansion's floral arrangements. By 1910, Lynnewood Hall had achieved something remarkable. It had become both a private home and a public institution. The Widener art collection was considered the finest in America, surpassing many European royal collections in both quality and scope. The mansion itself had inspired other wealthy Americans to commission their own palaces, creating a golden age of residential architecture. Yet even as Lynnewood Hall reached the height of its influence, shadows were gathering. Peter Widener was growing older, and his health showed signs of strain from decades of intense business activity. His eldest son George had taken over much of the daily management of the family's financial empire. But in April 1912, George made a decision that would forever change the Widener family's fate. He booked passage home from Europe on a new ship called Titanic. The golden age of Lynnewood Hall was about to encounter its first great tragedy, one that would test whether even the greatest palace in America could shelter its inhabitants from life's deepest sorrows. Chapter 5. The Titanic's Shadow. April 15, 1912. While Peter Widener slept in his magnificent bedroom at Lynnewood Hall, 1,500 miles away in the frigid North Atlantic, his son George and grandson Harry were fighting for their lives as RMS Titanic slipped beneath the waves. By dawn, the Widener family's greatest tragedy would cast a shadow over America's grandest mansion that would never fully lift. George Dunton Widener had everything a man could want. At 47, he had proven himself a worthy heir to his father's streetcar empire, expanding operations while maintaining the high standards Peter had established. He had married Eleanor Elkins, daughter of Peter's business partner William Elkins, cementing both a family alliance and a genuine love match. Their 3 children represented the next generation of Philadelphia aristocracy, and their son Harry showed particular promise as a scholar and collector. The European trip that would claim their lives had been planned as both business and pleasure. George needed to inspect streetcar operations in European cities, studying innovations that might benefit American operations, But the family also intended to purchase art for the Lynnewood Hall collection, which had gained international recognition for its quality and scope. Harry, now 27 and a Harvard graduate, had developed his own passion for rare books and manuscripts. When time came to book passage home, the choice seemed obvious. The White Star Line's new ship Titanic was being called unsinkable, the largest and most luxurious vessel ever built. Peter Widener himself held significant investments in the International Mercantile Marine Company, which controlled White Star Line. For America's wealthiest family, first-class passage on the ship's maiden voyage represented both a sound business decision and an appropriate level of luxury. The Wideners traveled with Eleanor's maid and George's valet, occupying some of the ship's finest accommodations. Fellow passengers included other American millionaires, John Jacob Astor, Isidore and Ida Strauss of Macy's department store, and Benjamin Guggenheim of the mining fortune. The passenger manifest read like a directory of American wealth, and conversation in the first-class dining room often focused on the business opportunities awaiting their return to New York. What the passengers didn't know was that their ship was steaming through an ice field at nearly full speed, despite repeated warnings of dangerous conditions ahead. Captain Edward Smith, making his final voyage before retirement, was under pressure to arrive in New York on schedule, maintaining Titanic's reputation for both luxury and punctuality. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, lookouts spotted an iceberg directly ahead. Despite desperate attempts to avoid collision, Titanic struck the ice with crushing force. Water began flooding the ship's supposedly watertight compartments, and within 2 hours, the unsinkable ship would disappear forever. The tragedy that followed revealed both the best and worst of human nature. Women and children were loaded into lifeboats first, but there weren't enough boats for everyone aboard. George and Harry Widener, following the gentleman's code of their era, ensured Eleanor reached safety before considering their own escape. George's last words to his wife were a promise that he and Harry would follow in a later boat. They never made it. When Titanic's final plunge came at 2:20 a.m., George and Harry Widener were among the 1,500 souls lost to the frigid Atlantic. Eleanor survived, one of only 710 people rescued by the ship Carpathia, but her life had been shattered. She had lost both her husband and her eldest son in a single night, a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her days. News of the disaster reached Lynnewood Hall by telegram, delivered to Peter Widener as he conducted morning business in his private office. The same man who had built an empire through decisive action found himself powerless against this unimaginable loss. His heir, a parent and beloved grandson, had simply vanished into the Atlantic darkness. Their bodies never recovered. The impact on the Widener family was devastating. Peter, already in declining health at 77, aged visibly in the weeks following the tragedy. Hannah Widener, who had helped create Lynnewood Hall as a celebration of family life, now walked its corridors, haunted by memories of the two family members who would never return. Eleanor Widener, pregnant with her fourth child when the disaster struck, gave birth to a son who would never know his father. But from tragedy came determination to honor the lost. Eleanor established the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University, ensuring her son's passion for books would benefit future generations of scholars. The library, built with a donation of $3.5 million, would become one of Harvard's most treasured buildings, with Harry's own rare book collection forming the core of what would become one of America's great literary repositories. Peter Widener, meanwhile, threw himself into managing the family's remaining affairs, but his heart was broken. The art collection that had brought him such joy now served as a reminder of dreams shared with family members who could never return. When he walked through Lynnewood Hall's galleries, he saw not just masterpieces by old masters, but spaces where George and Harry had discussed their own collecting ambitions. The Titanic tragedy transformed Lynnewood Hall from a celebration of American achievement into something more complex, a monument to both the possibilities and fragilities of human ambition. The mansion's grandeur remained unchanged, but its emotional landscape had been forever altered. Joseph Widener, Peter's younger son, would inherit an empire, but also the weight of preserving a family legacy shadowed by unimaginable loss. As Peter Widener's health continued to decline in the years following the Titanic disaster, Lynnewood Hall prepared for its next chapter. The Golden Age was ending, and the mansion would soon face the challenge of surviving in a world that was beginning to question whether private palaces had any place in modern America. Chapter 6. The Last of the Titans, November 6, 1915. As autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Lynnewood Hall, Peter Errol Brown Widener drew his last breath in the bedroom where he had hoped to spend many more years surrounded by family and the art he loved. At 80, the man who had transformed himself from a butcher's apprentice into America's streetcar king died as he had lived, quietly, without ostentation, but leaving behind an empire that would shape American transportation for decades to come. The 3 years following the Titanic disaster had been brutal for Peter. Already suffering from Florentine diabetes, his health deteriorated rapidly after losing George and Harry. Friends who visited Lynnewood Hall during this period described a man haunted by grief, walking the mansion's corridors like a ghost in his own palace. The art collection that had once brought him such pleasure now felt like a burden too heavy to bear alone. Yet Peter's final years also revealed the strength that had carried him from immigrant poverty to unimaginable wealth. Rather than retreating from the world, he increased his philanthropic activities, establishing the Widener Memorial Home for Crippled Children as a tribute to his late wife Hannah, who had died in 1896. When the Titanic took George and Harry, Peter added another wing to the facility in their memory, ensuring that children with disabilities would receive care regardless of their family's ability to pay. The mansion during this period took on a different character. Where once it had buzzed with entertaining and family gatherings, Lynnewood Hall became a more contemplative space. Peter spent hours in the library reading business reports and corresponding with civic leaders about philanthropic projects. The art gallery served as his private retreat where he could study masterpieces that had comforted him through life's greatest trials. Joseph Widener, Peter's surviving son, gradually assumed more responsibilities for the family's business empire. Unlike his father and brother George, Joseph showed little interest in the day-to-day operations of streetcar lines and steel investments. His passion lay in expanding the art collection and breeding thoroughbred racehorses. This shift in focus would prove significant for Lynnewood Hall's future, as Joseph viewed the mansion less as a family home and more as a museum requiring professional management. The business empire Peter had built continued to generate enormous wealth, even as his personal involvement decreased. Streetcar systems in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and other major cities provided steady income, while his investments in U.S. Steel, American Tobacco Company, and Standard Oil multiplied his fortune during America's continued industrial expansion. By the time of his death, Peter's estate was valued at over $31 million, with additional assets bringing the total well above $50 million. But Peter understood that his greatest legacy wouldn't be measured in dollars. The art collection housed at Lynnewood Hall had become one of the world's great cultural treasures, featuring masterpieces that European museums coveted but could never afford to acquire. Peter had always intended that this collection would eventually benefit the public rather than remaining private family property. In his final years, he spent considerable time planning how best to ensure these treasures would be preserved and shared with future generations. The mansion itself during Peter's final period reflected both grandeur and melancholy. Rooms that had once hosted international dignitaries now serve primarily as galleries for quiet contemplation. The ballroom, designed for 1,000 guests, was used mainly for small family gatherings and meetings with business associates. The extensive staff continued to maintain the house in perfect condition, but the vibrancy that had characterized Lynnewood Hall's early years had diminished. Peter's death marked the end of an era, not just for the Widener family, but for American capitalism itself. He belonged to the generation of self-made tycoons who had built the industrial infrastructure that would define modern America. Like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Clay Frick, Peter had accumulated wealth on a scale that would become increasingly difficult to achieve as government regulation and taxation limited individual accumulation of capital. The funeral services reflected both Peter's prominence and his essential humility. While thousands attended public ceremonies in Philadelphia, the private burial at Laurel Hill Cemetery was limited to family and close friends. The man who could have afforded the most elaborate monument chose instead a simple gravestone that recorded his birth, death, and dedication to family. Even in death, Peter Widener eschewed ostentation. Joseph Widener's inheritance transformed him instantly into one of America's wealthiest individuals, but also one of its most burdened. Along with the fortune came responsibility for maintaining Lynnewood Hall, preserving the art collection, and managing business enterprises that employed thousands of workers. Unlike his father, who had built the empire through personal relationships and hands-on management, Joseph would need to navigate an increasingly complex world of corporate structures and professional administrators. The transformation of Lynnewood Hall from family home to art museum began almost immediately after Peter's death. Joseph understood that the mansion's 110 rooms were far too large for his own family's needs, but also that the building's primary purpose had always been to showcase the collection. During the 1920s and 1930s, Lynnewood Hall would achieve its greatest fame not as a private residence, but as America's finest privately owned art museum, open to the public and rivaling anything Europe could offer. Peter Widener's death marked the beginning of Lynnewood Hall's second chapter, one in which the mansion would face new challenges as America entered the modern era. The age of private palaces was ending, and even the greatest houses would need to justify their existence in a world increasingly skeptical of extreme wealth concentration. For Lynnewood Hall, survival would depend on proving that some beautiful things transcended private ownership and belonged to all humanity. Chapter 7. A Gift Nobody Wanted. October 26, 1943. Joseph Widener died at Lynnewood Hall at the age of 71, ending the last chapter of the mansion's life as a true family home. Unlike his father's passing, which marked the end of an era, Joseph's death felt like the closing of a book that few people wanted to read anymore. The world had changed dramatically since Peter Widener first dreamed of building America's greatest palace, and private treasure houses were becoming as obsolete as the horse-drawn streetcars that had funded their creation. Joseph had been the perfect caretaker for his father's legacy. Where Peter had been a builder and entrepreneur, Joseph was a preserver and perfectionist. He had spent 28 years not just maintaining the Lynnewood Hall collection, but refining it into what many considered the finest group of old master paintings in America. Under his stewardship, the mansion had achieved international recognition as a cultural institution that rivaled the greatest museums of Europe. During the 1920s and 1930s, Lynnewood Hall had truly become America's Versailles. The public visiting program that Hannah Widener had established was expanded, allowing art lovers from around the world to study masterpieces that most museums could only dream of acquiring. Distinguished visitors during this period included museum directors from major European institutions, prominent artists seeking inspiration from the masters, and scholars researching art history's greatest works. But by the early 1940s, the challenges facing Lynnewood Hall had become insurmountable. The mansion's annual operating costs exceeded $100,000, equivalent to over $1.5 million today, while property taxes continued rising as local municipalities sought revenue during wartime. The staff required to maintain 110 rooms, extensive grounds, and priceless artworks numbered in the dozens. Most importantly, Joseph's children showed little interest in dedicating their lives to preserving what their great-grandfather had created. Joseph had recognized these realities years before his death and made the most generous decision possible. He would donate the entire Lynnewood Hall collection to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., ensuring that these treasures would be preserved for all Americans rather than remaining private family property. The announcement in 1940 sent shockwaves through the art world, as collectors and museums realized that one of the world's great private collections would become publicly accessible. The donation process took 3 years to complete, involving careful negotiations between the Widener family, National Gallery officials, and federal tax authorities. When finished in 1942, the gift included over 2,000 items, sculptures, paintings, decorative arts, porcelains, and tapestries, with a total value exceeding $50 million. Among the masterpieces were Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Bellini's Feast of the Gods, 2 Vermeers, 14 Rembrandts, 8 Van Dycks, and Donatello's Bronze David. Joseph insisted that the works be displayed in Washington exactly as they had been arranged at Lynnewood Hall, preserving his father's vision of how great art should be presented. Special galleries were constructed at the National Gallery to accommodate this requirement, and the Widener collection became the museum's crown jewel, attracting visitors from around the world who could now view these masterpieces without traveling to a private estate in Pennsylvania. The art's departure transformed Lynnewood Hall from a living museum into an empty shell. Rooms that had showcased humanity's greatest artistic achievements now displayed only faded rectangles on silk wallpaper, where paintings had once hung. The mansion's sophisticated lighting systems, designed specifically to enhance the collection, now illuminated nothing but memories. For the first time in its 40-year history, Lynnewood Hall stood vacant. Peter A.B. Widener II, Joseph's son, known as Fitz, inherited an architectural masterpiece but lacked both the means and motivation to maintain it. Unlike his grandfather and father, who had found purpose in preserving beauty for future generations, Fitz was primarily interested in horse racing and had no desire to dedicate his life to maintaining a 110-room palace. The fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible had been reduced by inheritance taxes, wartime restrictions, and the enormous costs of maintaining the estate. In 1944, just 1 year after Joseph's death, Fitz made the painful decision to auction the mansion's remaining contents. The sale became a cultural event, covered extensively by Life magazine and drawing collectors from across America and Europe. Room by room, the furniture, decorative objects, and architectural elements that had made Lynnewood Hall magnificent were dispersed to new owners. Louis XV chairs that had graced the ballroom were sold to private collectors. Persian rugs that had warmed limestone floors were rolled up and shipped to distant mansions. The auction marked a watershed moment in American cultural history. The dismantling of Lynnewood Hall's interiors symbolized the end of the Gilded Age's belief that private wealth could create lasting institutions. The mansion that had once represented the pinnacle of American achievement now stood as a monument to changing times and values. Even unlimited wealth could no longer sustain the kind of private palace that earlier generations had considered essential to cultured living. Local newspapers covered the auction with mixture of fascination and melancholy. Philadelphians who had visited Lynnewood Hall during its public viewing periods watched as their region lost one of its greatest cultural treasures. The mansion's rooms, stripped of their contents, revealed the building's extraordinary architecture, but also its fundamental problem. Without the collection that had justified its existence, Lynnewood Hall was simply too large, too expensive, and too specialized to serve any practical purpose. By the end of 1944, America's greatest private palace stood empty, its windows dark, its rooms silent. The family that had created one of the world's most magnificent homes had concluded that such magnificence no longer had a place in the modern world. Lynnewood Hall would need to find new purpose or face a fate that befell many Gilded Age mansions. Demolition. Chapter 8. Sanctuary and Seminary. May 1952. Reverend Carl McIntyre walked through the empty corridors of Lynnewood Hall, his footsteps echoing in rooms where America's wealthiest family had once entertained European royalty. The Presbyterian minister saw something different from the auction-goers who had stripped the mansion of its treasures 8 years earlier. Where others saw an obsolete palace too expensive to maintain, McIntyre saw potential. 110 rooms that could house a seminary dedicated to training fundamentalist Christian ministers. The mansion had stood vacant since the 1944 auction, maintained by a skeleton crew of caretakers who kept the building weatherproof but did little else. Vandals had broken several windows, and the elaborate gardens had begun reverting to wilderness. The Widener family, eager to end their financial obligations to the property, had placed Lynnewood Hall on the market for $192,000, a fraction of its original construction cost, but still a substantial sum for 1950s buyers. McIntyre's Faith Theological Seminary represented a different vision of American Christianity than the mainstream Protestant denominations that dominated established universities. Founded in 1937 after McIntyre broke with Princeton Seminary over theological disputes, the institution emphasized strict biblical interpretation and opposition to what McIntyre considered liberal trends in organized religion. By 1952, the seminary needed larger facilities to accommodate growing enrollment and McIntyre's expanding influence in fundamentalist circles. Purchasing Lynnewood Hall required significant financial sacrifice from the seminary's supporters, many of whom were working-class Americans drawn to McIntyre's populist interpretation of Christianity. The $192,000 purchase price was supplemented by an additional $150,000 for urgent repairs and electrical system updates needed to make the mansion suitable for educational purposes. For a religious institution operating on donated funds, this represented an enormous investment in the belief that God could transform a palace of worldly wealth into a sanctuary of spiritual learning. The transformation began immediately. The mansion's ballroom, which had once accommodated 1,000 guests for elegant parties, became the seminary's chapel, where students gathered twice daily for worship services. The art gallery that had housed Raphael and Rembrandt masterpieces was converted into a library, its sophisticated lighting systems perfect for serious study. Bedrooms that had pampered wealthy guests became dormitory rooms for young men studying to become ministers. The scale of Lynnewood Hall proved ideal for seminary life. Its 110 rooms provided classrooms, faculty offices, student housing, and administrative space with room to spare. The mansion's original servant quarters housed dining facilities and kitchen operations that could feed several hundred students and staff. The building's solid construction meant that multiple activities could occur simultaneously without interference. Lectures could proceed while organ practice continued in the chapel without disturbing students studying in the library. Under McIntyre's leadership, Faith Theological Seminary developed into one of America's most influential fundamentalist institutions. Students came from across the country and around the world to study conservative biblical interpretation in the mansion, where Peter Widener had once contemplated his art collection. The irony wasn't lost on observers. A building created to showcase material wealth had become a center for training ministers who preached spiritual values over worldly possessions. The seminary years marked Lynnewood Hall's longest period under single ownership since the Widener era. For over 40 years, the mansion served its educational mission faithfully, training hundreds of ministers who carried conservative Christian messages to congregations across America and overseas mission fields. The building's grandeur seemed to inspire rather than intimidate students, many of whom came from modest backgrounds and found the mansion's scale a reminder of God's abundance. However, the fundamental challenges that had ended the Widener family's stewardship gradually emerged during the seminary period. Maintaining 110 rooms, extensive grounds, and aging mechanical systems required constant attention and significant financial resources. The mansion's specialized features, lighting systems designed for art display, elaborate decorative plasterwork, imported materials requiring expert care needed increasingly expensive maintenance that strained the seminary's budget. By the 1980s, Faith Theological Seminary was struggling financially. McIntyre's fundamentalist movement had splintered over theological and personality disputes, reducing both enrollment and donations. The maintenance costs for Lynnewood Hall had become unsustainable for an institution dependent on contributions from a shrinking base of supporters. Deferred maintenance began affecting the building's condition, with roof leaks, electrical problems, and heating system failures creating ongoing crises. The seminary made the painful decision to begin selling parts of the mansion's interior to raise funds for basic operations. Decorative elements that had survived the 1944 auction, carved woodwork, marble fixtures, bronze details, were removed and sold to antique dealers and architectural salvage companies. Each sale provided temporary financial relief, but further damaged the building's integrity and historical significance. When McIntyre died in 2002, Faith Theological Seminary faced an impossible situation. The institution could no longer afford to maintain Lynnewood Hall, but decades of deferred maintenance had made the building difficult to sell. The mansion that had once been appraised in the millions was now seen as a liability, a deteriorating structure with enormous maintenance requirements and limited practical applications. The seminary's board of directors concluded they had no choice but to abandon the property and let new owners determine its fate. The seminary years had preserved Lynnewood Hall's basic structure while slowly hollowing out its soul. Like many adaptive reuse projects, the conversion had saved the building from immediate demolition, but couldn't address the fundamental mismatch between the mansion's grand scale and modern institutional needs. By the late 1990s, Lynnewood Hall stood on the verge of abandonment once again, its future more uncertain than ever before. Chapter 9: The Abandoned Palace. 1998. For the first time since its construction, Lynnewood Hall stood truly abandoned. Faith Theological Seminary had departed, unable to continue the financial struggle against the mansion's relentless maintenance demands. The 110-room palace that had once hosted European nobility and trained fundamentalist ministers now sat empty, its windows growing dark, its grounds reverting to wilderness. The abandonment that began in the late 1990s marked the start of Lynnewood Hall's most heartbreaking chapter. Without heat, the mansion's elaborate plaster ceilings began cracking as moisture seeped through an aging roof. The limestone facade, which had gleamed proudly for a century, started showing stains where gutters overflowed and downspouts failed. Windows that had been boarded up for security created a prison-like appearance that seemed to mock the building's classical grandeur. During this period, Lynnewood Hall became a magnet for urban explorers, adventurous photographers, and historians who specialized in documenting abandoned buildings before they disappeared forever. These brave souls, often risking legal consequences for trespassing, climbed through broken windows and walked empty corridors to capture images of decay that would haunt anyone who had known the mansion in its glory. Their photographs revealed a house in transition between grandeur and ruin. The ballroom where thousands had danced still retained its ornate plasterwork, but chunks of ceiling had fallen to the floor, creating miniature landscapes of rubble among the debris. The main staircase, carved from imported marble, remained magnificent, but its bronze railings had been stripped away by scavengers seeking valuable metals. The art gallery that had once housed America's greatest private collection became perhaps the saddest space of all. Sophisticated lighting systems designed specifically for displaying masterpieces now illuminated only empty walls marked by rectangular shadows, where paintings had hung for 40 years. The room that had inspired reverence in visitors from around the world was reduced to an empty shell, its purpose lost, along with the collection that had justified its existence. Water damage created the most devastating destruction. Pennsylvania's harsh winters and wet summers penetrated the building through failed roof sections, broken windows, and compromised foundations. The intricate parquet floors began warping and buckling. Silk wallpapers that had been imported from Europe peeled away from moisture-soaked walls. Elaborate wood paneling, much of it carved by hand in the early 1900s, swelled and cracked as humidity levels fluctuated wildly. Vandalism added insult to natural injury. Spray-painted graffiti appeared on marble walls that had taken Italian craftsmen months to install. Broken bottles and drug paraphernalia accumulated in rooms where Philadelphia's elite had once discussed art and politics. The mansion's security systems, designed for an earlier era, proved inadequate against determined trespassers who saw the empty building as a playground rather than a cultural treasure. Local media began referring to Lynnewood Hall as America's Versailles in ruins, a phrase that captured both the building's magnificent origins and its tragic current state. Newspaper articles documented each year's additional deterioration, creating a public record of slow-motion destruction that seemed inevitable but still shocking to witness. The mansion that had represented American achievement at its peak now symbolized the country's difficulty preserving its own cultural heritage. Various preservation groups attempted to organize rescue efforts during the abandonment period, but the scale of restoration needed exceeded any reasonable budget. Estimates ranged from $50 million to $100 million to return Lynnewood Hall to its original condition, amounts that dwarfed most preservation projects and discouraged potential donors. The mansion was simply too large, too deteriorated, and too specialized to fit conventional preservation models. Property ownership during this period became increasingly complex. The First Korean Church of New York had acquired Lynnewood Hall through foreclosure in 1996, hoping to establish a religious retreat and conference center. However, zoning disputes with local authorities prevented the church from operating the facility as planned. leaving the organization with a massive liability rather than a useful property. Years of legal battles over taxes, zoning permits, and building codes consumed time and resources that might have been spent on preservation. The church, originally well-intentioned, found itself trapped by the same economic realities that had defeated the Widener family, Faith Theological Seminary, and every other owner since the 1940s. Lynnewood Hall required not just money, but institutional commitment and expertise that few organizations possessed. Urban explorers' photographs from this period document not just physical decay, but the gradual loss of details that had made the mansion special. Ornate light fixtures disappeared, presumably sold to cover basic property taxes. Carved wooden elements vanished piece by piece as scavengers stripped anything valuable enough to resell. Even basic architectural hardware, doorknobs, hinges, window latches, was removed by thieves who understood that Lynnewood Hall's original fittings were crafted to standards no longer achievable at any price. By 2010, the mansion that had once been called the last American Versailles had become America's most famous abandoned palace. Documentary filmmakers, architecture students, and preservation activists made pilgrimages to witness the slow destruction of one of the country's greatest buildings. Their efforts created public awareness but couldn't generate the massive financial commitment needed to reverse decades of neglect. The abandonment period tested whether American society truly valued architectural heritage when preserving it required significant sacrifice. For over a decade, Lynnewood Hall stood as a question mark, challenging anyone who cared about beautiful buildings to prove that caring could be translated into effective action. The answer would determine not just the mansion's fate, but whether future generations would inherit America's greatest architectural treasures or only stories about what had been lost. Chapter 10. Phoenix from the Ashes, June 27, 2023. After 25 years of abandonment, Lynnewood Hall finally found its saviors. The Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation, a nonprofit organization founded specifically to rescue America's greatest abandoned mansion, completed the purchase that would determine whether Peter Widener's palace would survive for future generations or join the long list of Gilded Age mansions lost forever. The moment marked the culmination of years of planning by Edward T. Tome, the foundation's executive director, who had first discovered Lynnewood Hall as an 11-year-old boy and spent decades researching its history. Unlike previous owners who had struggled to find profitable uses for the massive estate, Tome and his colleagues understood that the mansion's significance transcended commercial considerations. They envisioned Lynnewood Hall as a cultural center that would combine historical preservation with educational programming, ensuring that Peter Widener's architectural legacy would serve the public good. The $9 million purchase price represented both a bargain and an enormous challenge. While far below the mansion's potential value if fully restored, the amount was substantial for a preservation foundation operating on donated funds. More daunting was the estimated $50 million needed to return the building to its original condition, requiring the foundation to develop innovative funding strategies and phase restoration work over many years. Initial assessments revealed the full scope of the challenge. 25 years of abandonment had taken a severe toll on the building's mechanical systems, roof, windows, and interior finishes. Water damage had destroyed many decorative elements, while vandalism and theft had stripped away architectural details that would be impossible to replicate exactly. Yet the mansion's basic structure remained sound, testament to Horace Trumbauer's insistence on using the finest materials and construction techniques available in 1900. The Preservation Foundation's approach differed fundamentally from earlier rescue attempts. Rather than trying to restore Lynnewood Hall as a private residence or single-purpose institution, they planned a multi-purpose facility that would generate revenue while serving educational and cultural missions. The mansion would become a venue for special events, educational programs, architectural tours, and arts presentations, with different spaces activated for different activities throughout the year. Restoration work began immediately, focusing on essential infrastructure before addressing decorative details. The roof, which had allowed water infiltration for over 2 decades, received priority attention to prevent further structural damage. Windows were repaired or replaced to secure the building envelope. Heating and electrical systems, many dating to the seminary period, were updated to modern standards while respecting the mansion's historical character. The foundation's commitment to historical accuracy guided every restoration decision. Rather than modernizing the mansion beyond recognition, they studied surviving photographs, architectural plans, and written descriptions to recreate Peter Widener's original vision. When original materials couldn't be located, craftsmen were commissioned to recreate details using traditional techniques, ensuring that restored elements would blend seamlessly with surviving original work. Public support for the rescue effort demonstrated that Americans were still willing to fight for architectural heritage when presented with compelling leadership and clear plans. Donations came from individuals who remembered visiting Lynnewood Hall during its museum period, architecture enthusiasts who understood the building's significance, and community members who wanted their region to preserve its greatest cultural treasure. The restoration process became an educational program itself, with specialist craftsmen teaching traditional techniques to students and volunteers. The project created opportunities for artisans to practice skills that had nearly disappeared, from decorative plastering to limestone carving to traditional glazing techniques. Lynnewood Hall became a laboratory for preservation methods that could be applied to other historic buildings facing similar challenges. Corporate partnerships provided specialized expertise that the foundation couldn't otherwise afford. Conservation laboratories donated services to clean and restore surviving decorative elements. Architectural firms contributed design services for adapting historic spaces to modern safety and accessibility requirements. Construction companies provided equipment and expertise for major structural repairs. By 2024, the first phase of restoration had stabilized Lynnewood Hall and made limited public access possible. Guided tours allowed visitors to see both the mansion's remaining original features and ongoing restoration work, creating revenue streams that would support future phases. The ballroom, restored to its 1920s configuration, began hosting special events that demonstrated the mansion's potential as a cultural venue. The Preservation Foundation's success in rescuing Lynnewood Hall provided a model for other abandoned Gilded Age estates facing similar challenges. Their approach, combining historical preservation with sustainable programming, phasing work over time, and building diverse funding sources, proved that even the largest preservation projects could succeed with proper planning and community support. Most importantly, the foundation had answered the question that had haunted Lynnewood Hall since the 1940s: whether private palaces created during the Gilded Age could find meaningful roles in modern America. By transforming Peter Widener's mansion into a public institution dedicated to education and cultural programming, they had created a sustainable model that honored the building's history while serving contemporary needs. Today, visitors to Lynnewood Hall can walk the same corridors where America's wealthiest family once lived. Study the craftsmanship that created one of the country's greatest houses, and contemplate both the possibilities and responsibilities that come with extraordinary wealth. The mansion that once symbolized private privilege now serves the public good, ensuring that future generations will inherit not just stories about America's architectural heritage, but the actual buildings that embodied the nation's highest aspirations. Peter Widener's palace has found its phoenix moment, rising from decades of abandonment to begin a new chapter that may prove more meaningful than its original incarnation. The last American Versailles has become the first example of how preservation can give historic buildings new life while honoring their original purpose, inspiring all who encounter them with beauty that transcends time, circumstance, and the limitations of any single generation's vision.